Okay, so we saw the very basic syntax. We made that ugly animated rainbow text. Now I want to dive a bit deeper into some of the ways we can control or finesse the animations. So here's the list of properties we'll talk about, and I've kind of grouped them into two categories. The first are the very basic, what I'm calling the usual suspects. Most of these have an analog to transitions. For example, transition dash duration, which you've already seen, or a transition timing function, or a transition delay. So those should be pretty familiar. And we also saw animation name, which is just how we specify what animation we're referring to. So those are pretty basic. But then there are some more specific ones that don't have analogs in the transition side of things. That includes iteration count, fill mode, direction, and play state. So I want to talk about those next. And rather than making a separate video for each one, I decided to kind of put them together in a single reference video. I've made different code pens to illustrate how they work, and we'll breeze through them hopefully. So there are 4 properties we'll take a look at in addition to these, which we've already seen, and hopefully you feel comfortable with. So the first one is animation iteration count, which we actually have seen as well, but I just wanted to bring this back up, want to repeat it, because it's pretty commonly used. So it allows us to specify how many times we want an animation to run. So I have a code pen that I've made to illustrate animation iteration count. It's kind of a mouthful. Currently it's set to infinite. You'll notice this button is jiggling, and it keeps going and going and going. So the animation itself, if you're curious, is a combination of scaling and translating. So it moves up and down ever so slightly and grows and shrinks. And that's essentially what makes it jiggle. And the hardest part is getting the timing right. I didn't make this myself. This is forked from an existing code pen that's really popular. I think it's just called Jiggle. So if you want to see the original, you can find that. But what I want to focus on is iteration count. So as you can see, it's still going, but I could change it to 2. And if I save, okay, there's our first one. Here's the second one. And now it's done. And I won't waste your time anymore, but of course you could change this to be any other number that you wanted. Okay, so that's animation iteration count. Next up is animation direction. And this one is a little bit less self-explanatory, at least right off the bat. Hence my subtitle. Let's just look at an example. It'll be easier. What it allows you to do is when you have an animation defined, you go from 0 to 100. And what you could do is actually have it run in reverse if you wanted, or you can have it alternate where it goes forward and then backwards, then forwards and then backwards. But like I said, it's easier to take a look at it in action. So here's a demonstration. So what I'm going to do first is actually turn off all animations. So just with this right here. Okay, so I have 3 boxes. One that has forward, one that has reverse, and one has alternate. That's just the text right now being displayed, but they also have classes. So then I'm applying this animation slide right. So they start here and they slide to the right 500 pixels. Translate X 500 pixels. Okay, so that's it. So without animation direction, so I'll turn that off and start the animation back up, you'll see that they all slide to the right and then start over, and they continue forever. I have iteration count set to infinite. So right now they're all uniform. But if I uncomment this code that assigns animation direction to be reverse on this middle box using the class reverse, if I set that animation direction to be reverse, I end up with this. So they're in sync, they're starting at the same time, but this one instead starts at 100 and works backwards down to 0. So it moves from right to left instead. So that's actually very nice. It allows you sometimes to reuse animations. So if you want to have something happen mirrored on the left and right side or whatever it is, you want opposites. You want the same animation just running in the opposite direction. You don't have to define a second animation. You can run animation direction reverse, and it does that for you. And then that brings us to alternate. And what alternate does is it combines the two. So it will run forward and then run backwards and then run forward and backwards and so on. So if I uncomment this code, you'll see that this bottom one, focus on that, goes backwards and forwards, and it keeps alternating. While these two continue in their single direction, whether it's forward or reverse. Alternate goes forward and then reverse. Now, iteration count doesn't have to be set to infinite for this to work. I could change it to something like 3, And I just saved. Okay, so there's our first one, and the second one, and now the third one, and now it's done. But you can see that the same direction is still applying the exact same way. So that's unchanged. That brings us to our next property, which is animation fill mode. So this one's a bit different. Animation fill mode will specify how an animation should apply styles before the animation actually starts and then after the animation ends. And when I say before the animation starts, that doesn't mean just any time before the animation. It means during the animation delay. So there's a period where the animation is engaged, but it's not actually playing if you have a delay. So let me show you what I mean. Here's an example. I have let me zoom out a bit so you can see them, 4 paragraphs going across the page. And all of them have been assigned this animation that they start as green, but this animation here takes them to yellow at 0% and then red at 100%. So it looks like this. As I hover, there's a delay, but you'll see it goes yellow and then red. So the key thing that I want to point out is that there's a delay right now. If I scroll up, animation delay 2 seconds. So I hover, and for 2 seconds, nothing happens, and then yellow to red. So what I'd like you to notice is that when I hover, before it actually kicks in during the delay, it stays green, and then after it turns red at the end, it goes back to green. So the animation delay starts, nothing happens. It doesn't change color until the delay is over, at which point it goes from yellow, which was the animation's 0%, and it goes to red at the end, and then once it hits the end of the animation, it reverts back to the state from before, which is green. Okay, so what I've done on the other 3, as you probably can infer by now, is I've gone ahead and applied an animation fill mode. So let's take a look at forwards. So what saying animation fill mode forwards does is it takes the end state, the 100% of the animation, and it will linger after the animation ends. So let me show you here. I hover over forwards, nothing happens, it goes yellow and then red, and then it stays red until I'm done hovering at least, and it goes back. So one more time, it starts, the animation delay works just the same way, but it stays red at the end. And then the next one is backwards. And by setting it to be backwards, animation fill mode backwards, it will take the 0% value of the animation and apply that immediately during the animation delay. So let me show you. I hover and it turns yellow right away, but there's still a delay until the actual animation starts. So one more time. Turns yellow as soon as I hover, and then it waits 2 seconds to start the animation. And then at the end, it goes back to green. And then the final option is both. And I'll show you that here, animation fill mode both. It just combines what forwards and backwards does. So it will turn yellow immediately, and then it will stay red after the animation ends. So it turns yellow during the delay, then the animation starts about now, and then it stays red afterwards. Okay, so that's the basics of animation fill mode. I'd say out of all of those, the only one I ever see used is forwards. Oftentimes you have an animation you want to run one time, and then you want it to stay in that end state afterwards, in which case you would use forwards, rather than having it snap back to the initial state. So the final property we'll take a look at is animation play state, and what this does is it lets you specify whether an animation is running or if it's paused. So it's pretty simple. Although I'll be honest, most of the time when I end up using this is actually through JavaScript where I'm manipulating this property. But I'll show you a working demonstration. So if we go to our animation direction demo, let me change this iteration count back to infinite. I'll make this a bit bigger too. Okay, so we have them running. What I can do, if I scroll down, let's add something new here where I hover over any of these boxes, it should pause the animation. So I'll just do .box, hover, and then the property is animation play state, and then paused. So now when I hover over any box, it will pause the animation. Now the trick is just hovering. Okay, there we go. I caught one. And you'll see it does pause it. It doesn't restart the animation from the beginning. It restarts from where it was paused. So it's different than just completely starting the entire animation over or removing the animation and adding it again, which is why it's useful. If you're doing this, sometimes in JavaScript, there are times where you want to pause an animation and then have it resume. Other times, you want to stop an animation altogether and have it start over. And to do that, you can't use animation play state. You need to just remove the animation and reapply it through JavaScript. So as you can see, this is how play state paused works. You could do the opposite. So I could have it start off as paused, and then when we hover, I could change this to running, which is the other opposite value. And you can see when I hover, it starts running. There we go. So those are the 4 properties I wanted to highlight. We have iteration count, which allows us to specify how many times it should run. And the key one is infinite. That's a very common one. Then we've got fill mode, which allows us to specify what happens right before and after the animation, what state should linger or not linger. Then we've got direction. Should the animation run from 0 to 100 or from 100 to 0, or should it alternate? And then play state, which allows us to pause or resume the animation. Okay, so those 4 properties in conjunction with these 4 are everything that you need to create CSS animations. We're now going to build a simple exercise together, and then afterwards I'll show you a shorthand, just like there was for transition, where we can combine all of these into a single line.